type. They have everything except liberty, which is something to think about. It could be a slogan for post-World War II United States. These are two little clips, the first of two clips that I found looking at Life magazines right after the war started. And I thought maybe it gives a clue as to why the Japanese population on the West Coast was interned. Not that I have an explanation, but if I look at this, I think I can see a possible explanation, which we can take as a proposition. No country can go to war and instantly begin to fight that war. It takes time to mobilize and prepare your forces and get them to where they have to go. And particularly in this situation where you had large numbers of people and you had two fronts, and there had already been some mobilization, the speed of mobilization is continuing to increase. And yet the way the United States entered World War II through Pearl Harbor seemed to demand some kind of instant response, but the government couldn't respond instantly. 1942 was essentially a year of getting everything in place. 1943 was getting the stuff out to the fronts, and 1944 was prevailing over the armed forces of both sides, and 1945 was essentially mopping up. Doesn't mean every phase of that was brutal. But before the United States could actually engage the enemy, it had to get its house in order. This led to a lot of people, particularly longtime critics of Roosevelt and the New Deal, saying that the government had no idea how to fight a war. They were sitting on their hands. They were passive. And this is what this little column is talking about. The criticism that was spreading around the country about the futility of the war effort, the lack of the war effort, Now, Roosevelt and his allies in the press addressed the bigger problem by trying to label such critics of how he was handling the war as essentially German agents. So he was discrediting them. But at the same time, there was something that he could do right away. That is, on the West Coast, the governors of the 3 states and many local politicians were avidly, particularly from the Republican Party, were avidly demanding that the Japanese be rounded up, put in concentration camps, and have their citizenship revoked, as it happened in Canada. The executive order that rounded up the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast was an easy way of placating some of his most virulent critics, including Earl Warren, who was at that time Attorney General of the state of California and running for governor on the Republican platform, and symbolically showing that the government could act fast, could do something. It was a way of staving off, I think. It could be seen as a way of staving off criticism. This other article is about the problem with one of the most important industrial companies in the world, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which had close relations with IG Farben Industrie and Nazi Germany, and the role that Standard Oil had played in sending patents to Germany, but not importing German-held patents into the United States. this was actually one of a series of problems that was happening, that American corporations that had close relationships with Germany were sometimes aiding the enemy by sharing secret information with their German counterparts. The federal government, the Justice Department, went after this kind of activity very ferociously. I think, again, the Japanese internment might be viewed in terms of trying to convey a message to potential critics that, yes, Roosevelt could round up anybody he wanted to, and that he would not concern himself with things like habeas corpus, which was also demonstrated by the arrest and secret trial and execution of a dozen Nazi spies. The whole thing was reported after the people were executed, and it was presented as evidence of Roosevelt's steeliness. And yet, in fact, there was no court reviews of this, what had happened, all of which had happened. These were people arrested in the United States and charged with crimes committed in the United States. So, by all court precedent, entitled to legal protections. But now, let's look at some advertisements, because actually the war allowed the government and business, the New Deal government and business, to make nicey-nice and become friends, to create a new set of relationships that would be very important in the post-war world. And throughout the war, most major U.S. corporations continued the same level of advertising that they had done before the war. They weren't selling to consumers, for the most part. Goodyear was not producing a single tire for private consumers. Everything was going to the government. But this was a way of conveying to the public through the advertising not only the patriotic fervor of the company, but how the war effort and the coming together of the American people was going to lead to a better society, a better and stronger and wealthier nation. This ad speaks to the constant fear that an enemy would secure control over an essential natural resource. Rubber had been one of the major issues dividing imperialists over control of rubber resources. During the war, federal funding into scientific research increased dramatically, to say the least. And one of the results, in addition to the atom bomb, was usable synthetic rubber. So that in the matter of less than 2 years, the United States no longer needed to rely on rubber imports. It was part of a process of becoming as self-sufficient as possible. But everyone was involved in the war effort. So International Harvester is showing the farmer as another soldier, for the country. Or General Mills is presenting itself as an essential part of U.S. foreign policy. That why do the hungry around the world ask for bread, and where is that bread going to come from? The United States, but from companies like General Mills, which will provide the bread that the United States government deems as needed in China or North Africa or Brazil. Now here's a metal products company advertising the sturdiness of of its products, their reliability as messengers of death. Or Chrysler, which also, again, Chrysler, you could not buy, and there were no Chryslers or Fords or any car produced for private consumption during the war. But Chrysler wants to show that the techniques that it developed to make the best cars, or so they claim, are now being devoted to making the best weaponry. This was part of the U.S. strategy in the war, was to keep U.S. casualties as low as they could be, and to increase the numbers killed of the enemy. In effect, to lower the unit cost of death for the enemy by applying industrial scientific management techniques. Another aircraft product, or Cine Kodak film. And even cough drops, echoing the message of the Private Snafu cartoon we saw. Keep your mouth shut. Don't gossip, but also don't cough. And, of course, even cigarette companies, for whom one couldn't imagine any kind of valid war effort, make themselves an important part of the war effort, or at least try to present themselves as essential to the success of the armed forces. And surrounding this was something also that was quite new in the United States, which was a celebration of manly military virtue, of a citizen army. Now, the statistical evidence suggests that of men born between 75% of men born between 1920 and 1940 served in the U.S. military. 75%, 3 out of 4 men. Thus, military service for essentially 2 generations became an expected, normal part of masculine life cycle. And if you didn't do military service, well, it would be odd. This would change with the 60s, with the Vietnam War, because with the baby boom, the demographics, simply the military didn't need that to maintain the draft levels at such a high percentage. So the 60s generation had much, much lower levels of military service, which might in part explain some of the generation gap and the difference in the ways in which people viewed their relationship with the government. One of the central features of the war was Roosevelt and his administration